with their eviction notice burning a hole in her purse and exactly $2,800 to her name. Isabella Moreau and her 13-year-old daughter Camille made what everyone called the worst decision of their lives, purchasing a crumbling cabin deep in the untamed swamplands of Terrebonne Parish, Louisiana, that locals whispered was cursed and had remained empty since the Great Hurricane 15 years prior. What they unearthed beneath the rotting cypress floorboards would not only change their destiny forever, but expose a conspiracy that stretched back to the blood-soaked days of Prohibition, when rumrunners and federal agents played deadly games of cat and mouse through these very bayous, leaving behind secrets that powerful families had spent nearly a century ensuring stayed buried beneath the Spanish moss and murky waters. Before we dive into Isabella and Camille's incredible journey, tell us in the comments where you're watching from around the world, and if this story captivates you the way it captivated us, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we're revealing what they discovered on their very first terrifying night in that God-forsaken swamp. And trust me, it's something that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about buried treasure. The oppressive Louisiana heat pressed down like a suffocating blanket as Isabella Moreau navigated her weathered 2005 Nissan Sentra along the crumbling ribbon of asphalt known as Bayou Road, her knuckles white against the steering wheel as ancient live oaks draped in Spanish moss created a tunnel of shadows on either side. The GPS on her cracked phone screen had given up 20 minutes ago, displaying only a blank gray void where their destination should be, leaving her to rely on handwritten directions that looked increasingly dubious with each passing mile. "Mama, are you absolutely sure about this?" 13-year-old Camille asked from the passenger seat, her voice carrying the particular blend of teenage skepticism and genuine worry that only comes from watching your parent make increasingly desperate decisions. "This place looks like where horror movies come to die." Isabella glanced at her daughter, trying to project a confidence she was far from feeling. At 31, Isabella had already survived more upheavals than most people face in a lifetime. 2 years ago, her husband David had been killed in an industrial accident at the Bayou chemical refinery where he'd worked for 8 years as a maintenance supervisor. The initial life insurance payout had seemed substantial until the medical bills from his final weeks in intensive care started arriving, each envelope bringing another devastating blow to their financial stability. What the insurance and their modest savings hadn't covered, the hospital's aggressive collections department had been ruthless in pursuing, systematically destroying Isabella's credit rating and eventually leading to the foreclosure notice that had arrived last Tuesday like a death sentence. "Sometimes you have to take a leap of faith, Sherry," Isabella replied, using the French endearment her grandmère Celeste had taught her, one of the few remnants of their Acadian heritage that hadn't been lost to generations of cultural assimilation in South Louisiana. "Besides, what other choice do we have? The shelter has a 3-month limit, and after that—" She didn't finish the sentence. They both knew what came after that. The choice, such as it was, had materialized in the form of a classified ad in the back pages of the local Houma Courier that seemed too bizarre to be legitimate. Historic Bayou property, immediate sale, $2,500 cash only, as is condition, no inspections, serious inquiries only, called Trosclair. The phone number had connected her to a man who spoke in the thick Cajun patois that was becoming increasingly rare even in the heart of Academia. He'd been brusque to the point of rudeness, giving her GPS coordinates instead of a street address and telling her to bring cash and expect nothing in the way of amenities or comfort. $2,500 represented every cent Isabella had managed to scrape together from a devastating fire sale of their possessions, David's prized bass boat, her grandmother's antique furniture, even her wedding ring, which had netted a heartbreaking $400 at the pawn shop on Main Street. The money had originally been earmarked for a security deposit on a rental apartment, but apartments required credit checks, employment verification, and references, none of which Isabella could provide in her current situation. This mysterious Bayou property, whatever condition it might be in, offered something no rental could ever guarantee: ownership, permanence, and perhaps most importantly, a place where no landlord could ever serve them with an eviction notice again. The paved road had surrendered to gravel 40 minutes ago, and now even the gravel was fading into a pair of deeply rutted tracks separated by a strip of swamp grass and punctuated by water-filled potholes that made her sedan bounce and scrape ominously. Ancient cypress trees, their bases flared and buttressed like cathedral columns, rose from dark water on both sides of the makeshift road. Spanish moss hung from their branches like tattered curtains, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that seemed to belong more to a Gothic novel than to 21st century Louisiana. Through gaps in the canopy, Isabella could see storm clouds building on the horizon, their dark bellies promising one of those sudden, violent downpours that characterize late summer in the Deep South. The radio had been talking all morning about a tropical depression forming in the Gulf. Nothing serious enough to warrant evacuation orders, but sufficient to dump several inches of rain on an area that was already more water than land.
"Look, Mama." Camille pointed ahead through the windshield, her voice tight with apprehension. "I think that's it." Isabella followed her daughter's gaze and felt her heart plummet into her stomach. Through a break in the cypress canopy, she caught her first glimpse of what their life savings had purchased, and it was worse than even her most pessimistic expectations. The structure before them couldn't generously be called a house. It was more like the skeleton of one, a small wooden building raised on creosote-soaked posts about 8 feet off the ground, connected to what passed for dry land by a sagging wooden walkway that looked like it might collapse under the weight of a strong breeze. The tin roof was so thoroughly rusted it had taken on the color of dried blood. The wooden siding had weathered to the gray-white of old bones, and at least half the windows were either shattered or covered with sheets of warped plywood that bore the spray-painted warnings of long-departed hurricane evacuees. Gone to Houston, and no pets left behind. But Camille, displaying the remarkable resilience that had helped her cope with her father's sudden death and their subsequent financial catastrophe, was already unbuckling her seatbelt with something approaching enthusiasm. "It's like a treehouse, Mama. Look how it sits up there like it's watching over the whole bayou, and we won't have any neighbors complaining about my music being too loud." Isabella parked at the end of what could only by the most generous interpretation be called a road, where whatever solid ground existed gave way to a bewildering mixture of black mud, standing water, and vegetation so thick and intertwined it was impossible to determine where the land ended and the bayou properly began. A rickety wooden pier extended from the muddy shore into deeper water, presumably for accessing the property by boat during the seasonal floods that were an unavoidable fact of life in this part of Terrebonne Parish. Several pilings were missing, and the surviving boards looked like they might have been installed sometime during the Coolidge administration. A figure emerged from behind the elevated cabin. A man who appeared to be somewhere in his mid-60s, with the deeply weathered skin and gnarled arthritic hands of someone who had spent his entire life working outdoors under the punishing subtropical sun. He wore faded denim overalls that had been patched multiple times with squares of different fabric, rubber boots that reached nearly to his knees, and a baseball cap so thoroughly faded and stained that its original color and any logos it might have once borne were matters of archaeological speculation. "You must be the Moreau woman," the man called out in the thick Cajun accent Isabella recognized from their telephone conversation. His voice carried the particular gravelly quality that comes from decades of cigarettes and humidity. "I'm Truss Claire. You brought the money?" Isabella patted her purse, where she'd carefully counted and recounted the 25 $100 bills that represented not just their entire financial future, but their only alternative to homelessness. The bills were crisp and new, obtained from the bank teller who had looked at her with barely concealed pity when she'd withdrawn their remaining funds. "Right here, but I'd like to see inside first, if you don't mind." Trosclair shrugged with the profound indifference of someone who had long ago stopped caring about other people's opinions or comfort levels. "Your funeral, Char. Come on then, but watch where you step. Some of these boards got more give in them than a politician's campaign promise, and the last thing anybody needs is for y'all to fall through and end up as alligator food." The walkway to the house swayed alarmingly under their combined weight, creaking and groaning like a living thing in distress, but proved to be more structurally sound than its dilapidated appearance suggested. Up close, Isabella could see that, despite its obviously neglected condition and the ravages of 15 years of abandonment, the structure showed signs of having been built by people who understood the unique challenges of constructing in a swamp environment. The foundation posts were thick cypress heartwood, naturally resistant to rot and insect damage, and showed no obvious signs of structural compromise. The frame, while aged and weathered to a silvery gray, appeared to be fundamentally sound, built with the kind of craftsmanship that had become increasingly rare in an era of mass-produced housing. "Built in 1924 by old Auguste Boudreau and his sons," Trosclair produced from his overall pocket a ring of keys that looked like they'd been collecting rust and corrosion since the Eisenhower administration. "3 generations of Boudreaux lived here, made their living running supplies up and down the bayou to the fishing camps and hunting lodges scattered through this part of the parish. August's boy Henry lived here right up until Katrina in '05. Storm took him and left the house empty. Family don't want nothing to do with the place no mo'."
The front door opened with a prolonged screech that sounded like something dying in considerable pain, revealing an interior that was both larger and more potentially livable than Isabella had dared to hope. The main room combined living space and kitchen in the traditional Creole style, with a substantial brick fireplace dominating one wall and the remnants of what had once been a functional kitchen running along another. The fireplace was faced with handmade bricks that had probably been fired right here on the property, and the hearth was deep enough to accommodate the large iron pots that would have been essential for feeding a family in the days before electric appliances. 2 smaller rooms branched off from the main living space, bedrooms presumably, and a narrow but sturdy-looking staircase led to what appeared to be a substantial loft space under the peaked roof. "Power got cut off years ago," Trosclair continued, playing the role of the world's most reluctant and pessimistic real estate agent. "No running water, no sewer connection of any kind. You'd need to bring in a generator for electricity, assuming you can find one that works, and dig a well for water, assuming you can hit fresh water and not just more swamp. There's an outhouse around back, though I can't speak to its present state of repair or aromatic qualities." Camille had already begun exploring with the fearless enthusiasm that only teenagers possess, her footsteps echoing through the empty rooms as she opened doors and tested the sturdiness of various fixtures. "Mama, come look at this!" she called from the smaller of the 2 bedrooms. Isabella followed her daughter's voice and found Camille kneeling beside a section of the cypress floorboards that were obviously loose and warped from decades of humidity and neglect. Several boards had separated enough to create gaps wide enough to peer through, revealing the dark space beneath the elevated house. "Look, you can see all the way down to the water," Camille said, lifting one of the loose boards with surprising ease. "It's like having a secret basement, except it's not really a basement because we're up in the air." Through the gap, Isabella could indeed see straight down to the muddy ground and standing water beneath the house, maybe 8 feet below. The space was dark and uninviting, filled with the kind of shadows that could hide any number of unpleasant surprises, from snakes to alligators to things she preferred not to contemplate. "That's just normal settling," Trosclair said, quickly, and Isabella noticed a distinct tension in his voice that seemed disproportionate to a few loose floorboards. "Old houses do that, especially in this climate. Nothing a hammer and some galvanized nails can't fix right up." But Isabella caught something in his tone, a nervousness that made her wonder what exactly he was nervous about. She made a mental note to examine those floorboards more carefully later, when she had time and privacy to investigate properly. The tour continued through the rest of the small house. The second bedroom was in better condition, with solid floors and intact windows. The loft space was surprisingly spacious, with enough headroom for an adult to stand comfortably, and windows that offered a commanding view of the surrounding bayou. On a clear day, Isabella imagined, you could probably see for miles across the wetlands. "Why are you selling it so cheap?" Isabella asked directly,
tired of dancing around the obvious questions. Even in this condition, with this much land, it has to be worth more than $2,500. Trustclair was quiet for a long moment, staring out through one of the loft windows toward the dark water that stretched away into the distance. Somewhere out there, an alligator bellowed, the sound echoing across the water like something from a primordial nightmare. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested he was choosing his words very carefully. The Boudreaux family moved to Houston after Katrina. Henry's kids, they don't want nothing to do with this place no more. Too many bad memories, they say. Too many old stories, better left buried. They just want someone to take it off their hands, no questions asked, no looking back, no stirring up things that'd been laying quiet for a long time. There was something in the way he emphasized no questions asked and things better left buried that suggested there were indeed questions that could be asked, and that asking them might not be particularly welcome or wise. Isabella walked through the house one more time, forcing herself to focus on possibilities rather than problems. The basic structure was sound. The floor was solid, except for those loose floorboards in the first bedroom. The roof showed no obvious signs of major leaks, and the few stains on the ceiling appeared to be old, from previous storms rather than ongoing problems. The windows could be repaired or replaced without too much expense. The fireplace could provide heat during the brief but sometimes bitter Louisiana winters. With work, a substantial amount of work, this could become not just livable, but actually comfortable. More importantly, it could become theirs, completely and permanently, with no mortgage payments, no rent, no landlord, and no one who could ever force them to leave. The nearest neighbor is old Boudreaux's cousin, lives about 5 miles northeast along the bayou. Other than that, you'd be completely on your own out here. No police patrols, no mail delivery, no garbage pickup. You'd need a boat to get supplies during flood season. And even in dry weather, that road we came in on can become impassable pretty quick if we get a heavy rain. In the growing darkness, something large splashed in the water not far from their pier, followed by what sounded like a low growl that could have come from an alligator or something else entirely. Camille moved instinctively closer to her mother, and Isabella realized that they were now truly on their own, miles from the nearest neighbor, with no telephone, no electricity, and no way to call for help if something went wrong. Tomorrow would bring a host of practical challenges that she hadn't fully considered when making their desperate gamble. How to generate electricity without bankrupting themselves on fuel costs. How to access clean water in an area where the groundwater was probably contaminated with saltwater intrusion. How to get supplies when the nearest store was an hour away and their car might not survive another trip on that terrible road. How to keep a 13-year-old girl entertained and educated in what amounted to complete wilderness isolation. But tonight, for the first time in months, they had a roof over their heads that belonged to them, that no one could take away, that represented security and permanence in a world that had become frighteningly unstable. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. What Isabella couldn't know as she and Camille prepared to spend their first night in the mysterious house on stilts was that beneath that roof, buried in the black mud of the bayou, lay secrets that would transform their lives in ways they never could have imagined. Secrets that certain people had killed to protect and that others had died trying to expose. Secrets that connected their isolated corner of the Louisiana wetlands to events that had shaped American history during the violent years of Prohibition, when rumrunners and federal agents had played deadly games of cat and mouse through these very waters, leaving behind a legacy of violence, betrayal, and hidden treasure that had been waiting nearly a century for someone brave enough or desperate enough to uncover it. The mystery of the Boudreaux property was about to reveal itself, and Isabella and Camille Moreau were about to become unwilling players in a game that had been playing out in these dark waters since the days when Al Capone's money flowed like whiskey through the hidden channels of the American South. As the first drops of rain began to fall, pattering against the rusted tin roof like nervous fingers drumming an anxious rhythm,
Isabella made one final walk through their new home, checking windows for leaks and mentally cataloging the most urgent repairs. In the smaller bedroom, she paused at the loose floorboards Camille had discovered earlier, kneeling to examine them more closely in the dim light filtering through the windows. The boards were definitely loose, warped and separated by gaps wide enough to see through to the dark space below. But as she looked more carefully, Isabella realized that the separation wasn't entirely due to age and weather damage. The boards had been deliberately pried up and then replaced, but not carefully or expertly. Someone had been down there, under the house, and recently enough that the tool marks on the wood were still relatively fresh and sharp-edged. Despite Trosclair's emphatic warning about not disturbing the foundation, Isabella found herself increasingly curious about what might lie beneath their new home. The house had been empty and abandoned for 15 years, but someone had clearly been under it within the last few months. Who would go to such trouble, and what could they have been looking for in the mud and darkness beneath an abandoned swamp house? Outside, the storm was intensifying rapidly, as Gulf Coast storms often do. She could hear the wind picking up, rattling the loose sheets of tin on the roof and setting the entire structure to creaking and groaning like a ship at sea. Lightning flickered in the distance, illuminating the swamp in brief, stark moments that made the cypress trees look like skeletal fingers reaching up from the black water toward a sky the color of old pewter. "Isabella," Camille called from the main room where she was arranging their sleeping bags near the fireplace, where they could have built a fire if they'd had any dry wood or newspapers to start it with. The rain was coming down harder now, drumming against the metal roof with increasing intensity, and occasionally finding its way through some gap or hole to drip steadily on the floor in various locations around the house. "Are you scared, Mama?" Camille asked quietly, her voice barely audible above the sound of the rain. Isabella considered lying, then decided that her daughter deserved honesty, especially now that they were going to have to depend on each other more completely than ever before. "A little bit, Sherry, but scared isn't always a bad thing. Sometimes being scared means you're doing something important, something that might change your life for the better. My papa used to say that courage wasn't about not being afraid. He said courage was about being afraid and doing the right thing anyway. Your papa was a very smart man, and he would be so proud of us right now for not giving up, for fighting to build a new life instead of just accepting defeat." As they settled into their sleeping bags with the storm raging outside and the unfamiliar sounds of the swamp surrounding them, Isabella felt a complex mixture of hope and terror about what lay ahead. They had taken an enormous gamble, risking everything they had left on a property they'd seen for less than an hour, in a location so remote they might as well have been on another planet. But they had also taken control of their own destiny in a way that felt both frightening and exhilarating. It was some time after midnight when Isabella was awakened by a sound that definitely didn't belong to the natural symphony of the storm. A rhythmic thumping was coming from somewhere beneath the house, regular and deliberate, and completely distinct from the random noises of wind, rain, and settling timber. Thump, thump, thump. At first, Isabella tried to convince herself it was something innocent, debris washed up by the rising water, or maybe a large piece of driftwood bumping against one of the foundation posts. But as she lay there in her sleeping bag, listening intently, the sound became more clearly defined and obviously purposeful. Thump, thump, thump. Like someone or something was moving around under the house with deliberate intent. Isabella's rational mind immediately began generating explanations. It could be an alligator seeking shelter from the storm, though alligators typically didn't make that kind of noise. It could be debris of some kind, though debris usually didn't move with such regularity. It could be the house itself, settling in response to the wind and rain, though she'd never heard settling that sounded quite so rhythmic and deliberate. But her instincts, sharpened by 2 years of single motherhood and constant vigilance in an often hostile world, told her that something was wrong. The thumping was too regular, too purposeful, too human to be accidental or natural. Moving as quietly as possible to avoid waking Camille, Isabella slipped out of her sleeping bag and made her way carefully to the loose floorboards in the bedroom. The thumping seemed to be coming from that general direction, and as she knelt beside the warped planks, she could hear it more clearly. Thump, thump, thump. Like someone or something was moving around under the house with deliberate intent. Isabella's rational mind immediately began generating explanations. It could be an alligator seeking shelter from the storm, though alligators typically didn't make that kind of noise. It could be debris of some kind, though debris usually didn't move with such regularity. It could be the house itself, settling in response to the wind and rain, though she'd never heard settling that sounded quite so rhythmic and deliberate. But her instincts, sharpened by 2 years of single motherhood and constant vigilance in an often hostile world, told her that something was wrong. The thumping was too regular, too purposeful, too human to be accidental or natural. Moving as quietly as possible to avoid waking Camille, Isabella slipped out of her sleeping bag and made her way carefully to the loose floorboards in the bedroom. The thumping seemed to be coming from that general direction, and as she knelt beside the warped planks, she could hear it more clearly. Thump, thump, thump. Definitely coming from directly below their bedroom. And now that she was listening more carefully, she could hear something else, a scraping sound, like metal against wood or stone, rhythmic and persistent. Fighting every survival instinct that told her to wake Camille and run for their lives, Isabella carefully lifted one of the loose floorboards and peered down into the darkness beneath the house. Lightning flickered at that exact moment, providing a brief but illuminating glimpse of the space below, and what she saw made her heart stop completely. There, in the muddy area between the foundation posts, something metallic gleamed in the lightning flash. Not natural debris, not an animal. Something deliberately buried or hidden, something that someone was now systematically working to uncover. And as the thunder rolled across the bayou like the footsteps of giants, Isabella realized with growing horror that they weren't alone on their supposedly isolated property. Someone else was there, working in the mud and darkness beneath their new home, digging for something that had been hidden there for decades. The mystery of the Boudreaux property was about to begin in earnest, and Isabella and Camille Moreau were about to discover that their desperate gamble had placed them at the very center of a secret that powerful families would kill to protect, and that others had already died trying to expose. Tomorrow would bring not just the practical challenges of surviving in the wilderness, but the far more dangerous challenge of staying alive long enough to uncover the truth about what lay buried beneath their new home, and why someone was willing to risk everything to dig it up on a dark and stormy night when they thought no one would notice. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the elevated house, Isabella lay awake until dawn, listening to the sounds of digging that continued methodically beneath her feet, and wondering what they had gotten themselves into. Yesterday, we left Isabella and Camille in their first night at the abandoned bayou house, where Isabella discovered someone was digging beneath their property during the storm. What she glimpsed in that lightning flash would change everything. But the real shock came with what they found the next morning. Today, we uncover the buried truth that powerful families have kept hidden for nearly a century. Dawn broke gray and humid over the Louisiana wetlands, the storm having passed during the early morning hours, but leaving behind the landscape transformed by several inches of rainfall. Isabella had barely slept, every sound from beneath the house making her pulse quicken. But the mysterious digging had stopped around 3 a.m., replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow more unnerving than the rhythmic thumping had been. "Mama, did you hear all that noise last night? It sounded like someone was building something under the house." Isabella's heart skipped. If Camille had heard it too, then it definitely wasn't her imagination or storm-induced paranoia. "What kind of noise, Cherie?" "Like hammering or maybe digging. It went on for hours." Camille sat up, running her fingers through her tangled hair. "Should we go look?" Every maternal instinct Isabella possessed screamed against investigating further. The smart thing would be to pack up immediately, drive back to town, and find somewhere else to go. Anywhere else. But where? They had no money left, no family to turn to, and no other options. This isolated swamp house was literally all they had left in the world.
"Let's get some breakfast first," Isabella said, buying time to think. "Then maybe we'll take a look around outside." They ate granola bars and drank bottled water while sitting on the front porch, watching the bayou come alive in the morning light. Herons picked their way carefully through the shallow water, and somewhere in the distance, an alligator's bellow echoed across the wetlands. The storm had left the air cleaner, but even more humid than before, and Isabella could already feel sweat beginning to form on her skin despite the early hour. "Mama, look!" Camille pointed toward the muddy area beneath the house. "There's something different down there." Isabella followed her daughter's gaze and felt her stomach drop. The mud beneath the elevated structure, which had been relatively smooth and undisturbed yesterday, was now churned up and scattered with what looked like excavated dirt. Someone had definitely been digging down there, and recently. "Stay here," Isabella instructed, but Camille was already climbing down from the porch. "Come on, Mama. We're in this together, right?" Against her better judgment, Isabella followed her daughter around to the side of the house where the digging appeared most concentrated. Up close, the evidence was unmistakable. Someone had been systematically excavating beneath the structure, creating several holes in the muddy ground and piling the excavated material in neat mounds. The work appeared professional, methodical. Not the random digging of treasure hunters, but the careful excavation of people who knew exactly what they were looking for. "Look at this," Camille called out, kneeling beside one of the larger holes. "There's something metal down here." Isabella approached cautiously, peering into the excavation. About 2 feet down, partially exposed, was what appeared to be the corner of a large metal container. The surface was heavily corroded but still intact, and it was clearly man-made, not some piece of natural debris or agricultural equipment. "We need to call the police," Isabella said, though even as she spoke the words, she realized how ridiculous they sounded. They had no phone service, no way to contact anyone, and even if they could, what would they tell the authorities? That someone was digging on their property? That they'd found some old metal buried in the mud? In rural Louisiana, such discoveries were hardly unusual. "Or," Camille said with the fearless logic of a 13-year-old, "we could finish digging it up ourselves and see what it is." "Absolutely not. This could be dangerous. What if it's some kind of industrial waste or chemicals or—" "Mama," Camille's voice was steady and serious. "Look at how carefully they dug around it. And look at these tool marks. Someone knows exactly what this is, and they want it bad enough to trespass on our property in the middle of a storm. Don't you think we should at least find out what's worth that much trouble?" Isabella studied her daughter's face and saw David there. The same determined expression he'd worn when he'd decided to take the job at the chemical plant, despite her concerns about the dangers. The same look he'd had when they'd decided to get married despite their family's objections. The same stubborn courage that had defined their life together. "We do this smart," Isabella said carefully. "We go back to town, get some proper tools, maybe some protective equipment. And if we find anything dangerous or illegal, we stop immediately and figure out how to contact the authorities." "Deal," Camille agreed eagerly. The drive back to Huma took nearly 2 hours on roads that had been turned treacherous by the overnight rain. Several times, Isabella wasn't sure her sedan would make it through the mud and standing water, but they eventually reached the hardware store on the outskirts of town. Isabella spent $200, money they could barely spare, on a shovel, pickaxe, work gloves, and a flashlight with extra batteries. On impulse, she also stopped at the public library and spent an hour researching the history of their property. What she found was both fascinating and deeply troubling. The Boudreau family had indeed lived on the property for 3 generations, but their involvement in the area went back much further. During Prohibition, the remote bayou location had made it an ideal stopping point for smugglers bringing illegal alcohol up from the Caribbean and Central America. According to a 1932 newspaper article she found in the library's archives, federal agents had raided several properties in Terrebonne Parish, including one remote bayou location where they discovered evidence of a major smuggling operation. The article was frustratingly vague about details, but it mentioned that substantial evidence of illegal activity had been uncovered and that several arrests had been made. More interesting was a follow-up article from 6 months later, reporting that the evidence from the raid had mysteriously disappeared from federal custody and that charges against several prominent local businessmen had been dropped due to insufficient evidence.
But the most intriguing discovery came in a 1934 article about the death of Auguste Boudreau, the original builder of their house. The article described him as a prosperous businessman who had connections throughout the region's shipping industry. It mentioned that he died under mysterious circumstances and that his considerable wealth had apparently disappeared, leading to speculation that it had been hidden somewhere on his extensive bayou properties. Isabella printed out the articles and returned to the car, where Camille was waiting with barely contained impatience. "Find anything interesting?" her daughter asked. "Maybe," Isabella replied, showing Camille the printouts as they began the long drive back to the bayou. "It looks like our property might have some history we didn't know about." By the time they returned to the house, the afternoon sun was beating down mercilessly, turning the humid air into something that felt almost solid. Isabella parked in the same spot as before and noticed immediately that something had changed. The mud around the excavation sites had been disturbed again. While they were gone, someone had continued the digging. "They came back," Camille observed unnecessarily. "Which means they might come back again," Isabella said, feeling a chill despite the oppressive heat. "We need to be careful." They approached the largest excavation site with considerably more caution than they'd shown that morning. The hole had been expanded significantly, and now Isabella could see that the metal object wasn't just a container, it was a substantial piece of equipment, possibly the size of a large trunk or small safe. "It's got numbers on it," Camille said, peering into the hole, "and some kind of writing." Isabella knelt beside her daughter and examined the partially exposed object more closely. The metal surface was heavily corroded, but she could make out what appeared to be stamped numbers and letters. The style looked old-fashioned, possibly from the 1920s or 1930s. "We're going to need more than a shovel to get this out," Isabella realized. "It's probably incredibly heavy, and it's wedged pretty firmly in the mud. So we dig around it first, see how big it really is. Then maybe we can figure out how to lift it." They spent the next 3 hours working in the stifling heat, carefully excavating around the mysterious object. What they uncovered was far larger and more complex than either had imagined. It wasn't just a single container, but what appeared to be several metal boxes or cases, connected or stacked together and partially covered by decades of accumulated mud and debris. As the afternoon wore on and more of the cache was exposed, Isabella began to understand why someone would risk trespassing to recover it. The objects were clearly valuable, not just monetarily but historically. The metalwork was of a quality that suggested they had been expensive even when new, and the careful way they had been buried indicated that someone had taken great pains to hide them safely. "Mama," Camille called out from the far side of the excavation, where she'd been working with the pickaxe. "I think I found something else." Isabella looked up from her own digging to see her daughter holding what appeared to be a leather-bound book, water-damaged but still intact. The cover was unmarked, but when Camille carefully opened it, they could see pages of handwritten text. "It's like a journal or diary, but it's hard to read. The writing is old-fashioned, and some of the pages are stuck together." Isabella took the book carefully, handling it like the fragile artifact it clearly was. The paper was of a quality that had allowed it to survive decades of burial in the humid environment, and the ink, while faded, was still legible in many places. The first page she was able to read clearly was dated August 15, 1929, and began with the words, "If anyone finds this record, know that what follows is the complete truth about the Terrebonne operation and how we accumulated the fortune now buried beneath this house." Isabella felt her heart begin to race. "Camille, I think we just found something incredibly important." She carefully turned the pages, reading snippets of text that painted a picture of a sophisticated smuggling operation that had operated throughout the 1920s. The journal appeared to belong to Auguste Boudreau himself, and it documented in meticulous detail how his family had used their remote bayou location to facilitate the movement of illegal alcohol from the Gulf Coast to markets throughout Louisiana and beyond. But the journal revealed something even more significant than a simple smuggling operation. According to Auguste's account, the Boudreau family hadn't just been facilitating the movement of alcohol, they had been partners in a much larger criminal enterprise that included prominent businessmen, politicians, and law enforcement officials throughout the region. One entry dated September 3, 1929, was particularly revealing. "Met with Thibodeau and Broussard today. They confirmed that the federal investigation is getting too close. We have agreed to liquidate our assets and hide the proceeds until the heat dies down. The total value of our combined holdings is approximately $2.3 million in cash, gold, and negotiable securities." Isabella had to sit down in the mud as the implications sunk in. $2.3 million in 1929 would be worth tens of millions today, and according to Auguste's journal, it was all buried right here beneath their house. "What does it say, Mama?" Isabella read the relevant passages aloud, watching her daughter's eyes grow wider with each revelation.
"So we're like millionaires now?" Camille asked when Isabella finished. "If the money is still here, and if we can legally claim it, and if no one else has a claim to it," Isabella said carefully. "There are a lot of ifs involved." She continued reading the journal, finding entries that described the careful burial of the treasure in multiple locations around the property. Auguste had apparently been meticulous in his record-keeping, creating detailed maps and measurements that would allow the cash to be recovered even decades later. But the final entries in the journal were more troubling. They described Auguste's growing paranoia about federal investigators and his suspicions that someone in their organization was cooperating with law enforcement. The last entry, dated October 12, 1929, was particularly ominous. "Thibodeau came by again today, asking too many questions about the exact location of the cash. I am beginning to suspect that he cannot be trusted. I have decided to change the burial locations without informing the others. If something happens to me, only this record will remain as a guide to the true location." The journal ended abruptly after that entry, and Isabella remembered from her library research that Auguste had died under mysterious circumstances sometime in 1934. So Auguste hid the money from his partners and then died before he could recover it himself. "Which means it's been sitting here for almost 100 years, Camille added excitedly. "And now we found it." But Isabella was beginning to understand that their discovery was far more complicated than a simple case of found treasure. If Auguste had double-crossed his partners in the smuggling operation, then there were probably descendants of those partners who still knew about the missing fortune.
And if someone was actively looking for it, as the midnight digging suggested, then Isabella and Camille might be in serious danger. "We need to be very careful about this," Isabella said. "If there are people who've been looking for this treasure for decades, they're not going to be happy that we found it first." As if summoned by her words, the sound of an approaching boat motor echoed across the water. Isabella and Camille looked up to see a small aluminum boat heading toward their pier, carrying two men in dark clothing. "Hide the journal," Isabella whispered urgently, "and act like we're just doing regular yard work." Camille quickly stuffed the leather-bound book inside her jacket, while Isabella grabbed the shovel and tried to look like she was doing normal property maintenance. But as the boat drew closer, she could see that the men approaching weren't casual visitors. They had the hard, watchful look of people accustomed to violence, and they were scanning the property with professional interest. The boat pulled up to the rickety pier, and one of the men, a tall, lean individual with graying hair and eyes like chips of flint, stepped onto the dock with practiced ease. "Mornin', folks," he called out in a voice that carried no warmth whatsoever. "Beautiful day for a little digging, isn't it?" Isabella felt her mouth dry. These men knew exactly why they were here, and they weren't interested in being neighborly. "Can I help you with something?" she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Matter of fact, you can," the man said, approaching their excavation site with obvious familiarity. "Name's Thibodeau. My family's been looking for something that belongs to us, something that got buried around here a long time ago. It looks like maybe you folks found it for us." The name hit Isabella like a physical blow. According to Auguste's journal, Thibodeau had been one of the partners in the smuggling operation, one of the people Auguste had suspected of betrayal. And now, nearly a century later, his descendants had tracked the treasure to its hiding place. "I'm afraid you're mistaken," Isabella said, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. "This is our property. We bought it legally, and anything on it belongs to us." Thibodeau smiled, but there was no humor in it. "See, lady, that's where you're wrong. My great-grandfather was partners with Auguste Boudreau in a business venture back in the 20s. When Auguste died, he took certain information with him, information about property that rightfully belongs to my family." The second man, younger and broader, had remained by the boat but was now moving closer, his hand resting casually on something beneath his jacket. "We don't know what you're talking about," Isabella said, but she could hear the tremor in her own voice. "Course you do. That's Auguste's old journal your daughter's hiding under your jacket, and that's our family's cash you've been digging up. Now, I'm a reasonable man, and I understand you folks didn't know the history when you bought this place, so here's what we're going to do. You're going to hand over that journal and step away from the excavation, and we're going to recover our property. In exchange, I won't have to explain to the sheriff how you came to be trespassing on a crime scene." Isabella's mind raced. These men clearly had resources and connections she couldn't match, but they were also trespassing on her property, and they were threatening her and her daughter. "The property belongs to us," she said again, more firmly this time. "We have the deed, and if there's any question of ownership of anything found here, that's a matter for the courts to decide." Thibodeau's expression hardened. "Lady, I don't think you understand the situation. My family has been looking for this cash for 95 years. We've invested considerable time and money in tracking it down. We're not about to let some desperate woman with a paper deed walk away with what belongs to us." "And I don't think you understand," Isabella replied, surprised by her own boldness. "This is legally our property, and you're trespassing. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." For a moment, the confrontation balanced on a knife's edge. Isabella could see Thibodeau weighing his options, calculating whether to escalate to violence or try a different approach. The decision was made for him when Camille suddenly called out, "Mama, there's another boat coming!" All four of them turned to look across the water, where indeed another boat was approaching rapidly. This one was larger, official-looking, and flying what appeared to be a law enforcement flag. "Sheriff's Department," the younger man reported to Thibodeau in a low voice. "Shit," Thibodeau muttered. "Someone must have called it in." Isabella had no idea who might have contacted law enforcement. They had no phone, and their nearest neighbor was miles away. But she wasn't about to question this stroke of fortune. "Gentlemen," she said with considerably more confidence, "I believe you said you were leaving." Thibodeau fixed her with a stare that promised this confrontation was far from over. "This isn't finished, lady. That cachet belongs to my family, and we're going to get it back, one way or another." The two men returned to their boat and sped away across the bayou just as the sheriff's department vessel arrived at the pier. A uniformed deputy stepped out, looking around the property with professional interest. "Ma'am, I'm Deputy Robichaud with the Terrebonne Parish Sheriff's Office. We received a report of suspicious activity at this location. Everything all right here?" Isabella looked at Camille, who shrugged slightly. Neither of them had made any report, which meant someone else was watching their property. "Two men just left in a boat. They claimed we were digging up something that belonged to their family, but this is our property. I have the deed." Deputy Robichaud nodded and made a note in a small pad. "Ma'am, I have to ask, have you found anything unusual on your property? Any artifacts or containers or anything that might be considered historically significant?" Isabella hesitated. Something in the deputy's tone suggested he knew more about their situation than he was letting on. "Why do you ask?" she replied carefully. "Well, this area has some history, you understand. During Prohibition, there were a lot of smuggling operations through these bayous. Sometimes people buried things they intended to come back for later. If you found anything like that, there are proper procedures for handling it." Isabella made a decision that would change everything. "Deputy, I think we need to have a longer conversation. Would you mind coming up to the house?" Over the next hour, sitting in the main room of their elevated home, Isabella told Deputy Robichaud the complete story of their discovery. She showed Auguste's journal, explained about the nighttime digging, and described the confrontation with the Thibodeau men. The deputy listened carefully, occasionally asking questions or making notes. When Isabella finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Ma'am, I think you and your daughter may be in more danger than you realize. The Thibodeau family has considerable influence in this parish, and they've been known to use aggressive methods to protect what they consider their interests." "But this is legally our property," Isabella protested. "Yes, ma'am, and the law will protect your rights as property owners, but the law can't be everywhere at once, and this is a very isolated location. I'm going to recommend that you consider staying somewhere else while we sort this situation out." "We don't have anywhere else to go," Camille said quietly. "This is all we have." Deputy Robichaud studied them both for a moment, and Isabella could see him making some kind of internal calculation. "Tell you what, I'm going to assign extra patrols to this area, and I'm going to open an official investigation into the Thibodeau family's claims. In the meantime, I'd strongly advise you not to do any more excavation on your own. If there really is a significant historical find here, it needs to be handled by professionals." "What happens to whatever we found?" That depends on a lot of factors. Louisiana has laws about archaeological discoveries, and there are federal regulations that might apply if this involves interstate commerce from the Prohibition era. But, as the property owners, you'd have certain rights that would be protected." After Deputy Robichaud left, Isabella and Camille sat on their front porch and watched the sunset over the bayou. The day had brought revelations that neither had expected, and dangers they were still trying to understand. "Mama, are we going to be rich?" "I don't know, Sherry. Maybe. But right now, I'm more concerned about keeping us safe." "What do you think is really down there? I mean, if it's worth this much trouble after all these years, it must be something incredible." Isabella felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. Metaphorically this time. "That's impossible. We have a deed. We paid cash." You have a worthless piece of paper signed by someone without legal authority, Thibodeau corrected, which means, technically, you're squatters on property that's still tied up in legal proceedings. Now, I'm not an unreasonable man. I understand you folks got taken advantage of by Trosclaire's little scam. So here's what I'm prepared to offer. He gestured toward the excavation site, where Isabella could now see that his men had been busy during the night. They had expanded the dig significantly and appeared to have uncovered more of the buried cash. You help us recover what rightfully belongs to my family, and I'll make sure you get compensated for your trouble. Let's say $50,000 for your time and effort. That's more than fair for a few days' work. And if we refuse? Isabella asked, though she was already sure she knew the answer. Well, then I'd have to report your trespassing to the sheriff's department. And given that you've been conducting unauthorized excavation on property you don't legally own, there could be criminal charges. Destruction of historical artifacts, disturbing an archaeological site, theft of cultural patrimony. The list goes on. Isabella's mind raced through their options, none of which looked promising. Even if Thibodeau's claims about the property deed were false, proving it would require lawyers, court proceedings, and time they didn't have. In the meantime, they were trapped on isolated property, with no transportation and no way to call for help. "I need time to think about your offer," she said, stalling for time. "Of course," Thibodeau replied with false magnanimity. "Take all the time you need. We'll just continue our archaeological work while you're deciding." Over the next several hours, Isabella and Camille watched helplessly as Thibodeau's team systematically excavated the area beneath their house. The men worked with professional efficiency, using proper archaeological techniques to carefully expose and document their finds. Whatever they were uncovering, they were treating it with the respect due to valuable historical artifacts. Around noon, one of the workers called out excitedly in French, and Thibodeau hurried over to examine something they'd discovered. Even from their elevated position, Isabella could see that they'd uncovered what appeared to be a large metal chest or strongbox. "Camille," Isabella said quietly, "I want you to take Augustine's journal and hide it somewhere they'll never find it. Under a loose floorboard, inside the fireplace chimney, anywhere that's not obvious." "Why? What are you planning?" "I'm planning to survive this, and to make sure that if something happens to us, there's evidence of what we found and who took it." While Camille hid the journal, Isabella tried to think of anyone who might help them. Deputy Robichaud had seemed genuinely concerned about their safety, but they had no way to contact him. Their nearest neighbor was miles away and might not even be home. Their only hope was that someone would notice their car abandoned on the property and investigate. That hope proved to be misplaced when, around 2 p.m., she heard the sound of her Nissan's engine starting again. Through the window, she watched as one of Thibodeau's men drove the car completely away from the property, probably to abandon it somewhere that would make it look like they'd left voluntarily. "Now we're really trapped," Camille observed. "Not necessarily," Isabella said, an idea beginning to form. "They want us to cooperate, which means they need us, and they're being careful to make this look legal and voluntary, which means they're worried about law enforcement. That suggests they're not as confident about their position as they're pretending to be." Around 4 p.m., Thibodeau approached the house again, this time accompanied by a woman Isabella hadn't seen before. She was well-dressed, professional-looking, and carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to being in charge. "Mrs. Moreau, I'd like you to meet Dr. Sarah Landry. She's an archaeologist from Tulane University, and she's here to authenticate our discoveries and ensure everything is handled according to proper scientific protocols." Dr. Landry stepped forward, and when she spoke, her voice carried the crisp authority of academic credentials. "Mrs. Moreau, I understand you've made some remarkable discoveries on this property. As a professional archaeologist, I can assure you that what we're uncovering here is of immense historical significance. This appears to be one of the most intact Prohibition-era caches ever discovered in Louisiana. "Are you working with them voluntarily?" Isabella asked pointedly. Dr. Landry hesitated slightly before answering. "I've been retained to provide professional oversight for this excavation. It's important that artifacts of this significance be recovered and documented properly." Something in her tone suggested she might not be there entirely by choice, and Isabella filed that observation away for potential future use. "The strong box we uncovered this morning contains approximately $847,000 in gold coins and currency from the 1920s. But according to the documentation we've found, this is only the first of several caches buried on this property. The total value could be extraordinary." Isabella felt a chill that had nothing to do with the bayou humidity. If there were multiple caches worth hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, then the stakes were far higher than she had realized. People had killed for far less.
"Mrs. Moreau," Thibodeau said, his voice taking on a harder edge, "I think you're beginning to understand the situation. This isn't just about some old coins buried in the mud. This is about a fortune that's been in my family's possession for nearly a century. Now, you can cooperate and take a fair share of the proceeds, or you can continue to be stubborn and face the legal consequences of trespassing and theft." "What legal consequences?" Isabella shot back. "You're the ones trespassing on our property." "Actually," came a new voice from the direction of the pier, "nobody's trespassing anywhere because this entire site is now under federal jurisdiction." Isabella looked toward the water and saw a sight that filled her with relief. Several official boats approaching their pier, flying the flags of various law enforcement agencies. The lead boat carried Deputy Robichaud, but he was accompanied by what appeared to be federal agents. "FBI, U.S. Marshals, everyone remain where you are." The next 30 minutes passed in a blur of badge displays, warrant readings, and tense negotiations between Thibodeau's legal team, who had apparently been on standby for just such a possibility, and the federal agents. Isabella and Camille watched from their elevated position as their isolated property transformed into what looked like the set of a legal drama. Eventually, Deputy Robichaud climbed up to the house to brief them on what was happening. "Mrs. Moreau, this situation has gotten a lot more complicated since we last spoke," he said, settling into one of the camp chairs they'd set up on the porch. "The FBI has opened an investigation into potential violations of federal antiquities laws, and the U.S. Attorney's Office is reviewing the circumstances of your property purchase." "Are we in trouble?" Camille asked. "Not necessarily," Robichaud replied carefully, "but you're not entirely in the clear either. The legal status of this property is genuinely unclear, and there are federal laws that govern the excavation of sites with historical significance." "What happens now?" Isabella asked. "Now, everyone stops digging while the lawyers sort things out. The FBI is going to secure the site and bring in their own archaeologists to properly document and evaluate what's been found. In the meantime, you'll need to find somewhere else to stay." "We don't have anywhere else to go," Isabella said. "And we don't have a car. Thibodeau's people took it." Robichaud frowned. "They took your car. That's definitely not legal, regardless of the property dispute." He made a note in his pad and called down to the federal agents. Within minutes, 2 of Thibodeau's men were being questioned about the missing vehicle, and their body language suggested they weren't comfortable with the line of inquiry. "Mrs. Moreau," Dr. Landry approached the porch, escorted by a federal agent. "I wanted to apologize for the circumstances of our meeting. I was told this was a legitimate archaeological excavation with proper permits and property rights. When I realized the situation was more complicated, I contacted the authorities." "You're the one who called the FBI?" Isabella asked. "I called my colleagues at the university who have connections with federal archaeological oversight.
When I described what I was seeing here, the scale of the discovery, the questionable legal circumstances, and the intimidation tactics, they advised me to report it immediately. "Thank you," Isabella said simply. Over the next several hours, as FBI agents and federal marshals took control of the site, Isabella began to understand the full scope of what they'd stumbled into. According to the preliminary assessment, the Boudreaux cache was potentially one of the largest Prohibition-era discoveries ever made in the United States. The historical and monetary value could reach into the tens of millions of dollars. But more important from Isabella's perspective, the federal investigation had revealed that Thibodeau's claims about their property ownership were largely fraudulent. While there were indeed some legal complications with the original sale, Trosclair had apparently cut some corners in the paperwork. Their purchase was fundamentally valid. The Boudreaux family trust had authorized the sale, and Isabella and Camille were the legitimate owners of the property. "So, what does that mean for us?" Isabella asked Agent Martinez, the FBI investigator in charge of the case. "It means you're not criminals," Martinez replied with a slight smile. "And it means you have certain rights as the property owners. But it also means you're now part of a major federal investigation, and there are protocols that have to be followed." As evening approached and the various law enforcement agencies began to wind down their initial response, Isabella and Camille found themselves in the surreal position of being refugees from their own property. The FBI had established a security perimeter around the excavation site, and they wouldn't be allowed to return to the house until the investigation was completed. Deputy Robichaud offered to drive them to a motel in Houma, where they could stay while the legal issues were sorted out. As they gathered their few belongings from the house, Isabella caught sight of Augustus' journal, still hidden in the fireplace chimney, where Camille had placed it. "Should we tell them about the journal?" Camille whispered. Isabella considered the question carefully. The journal was potentially crucial evidence in the federal investigation, and withholding it could create legal problems. But it was also their only independent source of information about the cache, and Isabella wasn't entirely sure she trusted all the various agencies and authorities that were now involved in their situation. "Not yet," she decided. "Let's see how this plays out." As they drove away from their property in Deputy Robichaud's patrol car, Isabella looked back at the mysterious house on stilts that had transformed their lives in ways they were still trying to understand. FBI agents had set up floodlights around the excavation site, and the area looked like an archaeological dig at night, which, she supposed, it now was. "Mama," Camille said as the house disappeared behind the cypress trees, "do you think we'll ever get to go home?" "I don't know, Sherry," Isabella replied honestly, "but I think our lives just changed in ways we can't even imagine yet." The motel room in Houma was clean but depressing. 2 double beds, a small television, and a view of the parking lot. Isabella had paid for 3 nights with money from their rapidly dwindling resources, and she had no idea what they would do after that. But as she and Camille sat on one of the beds and watched the local news coverage of the historic treasure discovery in Terrebonne Parish, Isabella felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time, a sense that they were part of something larger than their own struggles. The news reporter was interviewing Dr. Landry, who described the discovery as potentially one of the most significant archaeological finds related to Prohibition-era criminal activity ever uncovered in the United States. The footage showed FBI agents carefully documenting and removing artifacts from the excavation site, including what appeared to be multiple strongboxes and containers. Preliminary estimates suggest the total value of the cache could reach $20 to $30 million in today's money, but the historical value is incalculable. This discovery could shed new light on the scope and sophistication of criminal organizations during the Prohibition era. "What happens to the treasure now?" the reporter asked. "That will depend on a variety of legal factors," Dr. Landry replied diplomatically. "There are federal laws governing such discoveries, state regulations about archaeological sites, and civil law issues related to property ownership. It will likely take months or years to resolve all the competing claims." Camille muted the television and turned to her mother. "Do you think we'll ever get to go home?" "I don't know, Sherry," Isabella replied honestly. "But I think our lives just changed in ways we can't even imagine yet." The next morning brought both good news and bad news. The good news was that their car had been recovered, apparently abandoned in a parking lot in Huma, undamaged but with the keys missing. The bad news was that Agent Martinez wanted to interview them extensively about their discovery, and the questions suggested that federal investigators suspected there might be more to their story than they'd initially revealed. "Mrs. Moreau, I want to be clear that you're not under suspicion of any wrongdoing, but we need to understand exactly how you came to discover this cache and whether there might be additional evidence or documentation that could help our investigation." Isabella had spent most of the night thinking about this moment, weighing the pros and cons of revealing Auguste's journal. On one hand, cooperating fully with federal investigators was clearly the smart legal strategy. On the other hand, the journal might be their only leverage in what was likely to become a complex legal battle over ownership of the treasure. "Agent Martinez," she said finally, "I want to cooperate fully with your investigation, but I also want to make sure that my daughter and I are protected in this process. There are people who have made it clear they're willing to use illegal methods to claim this treasure, and I'm concerned about our safety." "I understand your concerns, and I can assure you that the FBI takes threats to witnesses very seriously. But I need you to understand that withholding evidence from a federal investigation is also a serious matter." Isabella made her decision. "There's something else you need to see." She told Martinez about Auguste's journal, explaining how they'd discovered it and what it revealed about the original burial of the treasure. When she finished, the FBI agent was quiet for a long moment. "Mrs. Moreau, this journal could be crucial evidence in our investigation. Where is it now?" "Hidden at the property," Isabella admitted. "We were afraid that if the Thibodeau people found it, they might destroy it or use it to locate other caches before law enforcement could intervene." Martinez nodded approvingly. "That was actually good thinking. Can you retrieve it for us?" "Are we allowed back on the property?" "Yes, under FBI escort, yes. And given what you've told me about this journal, I think we need to recover it immediately." 2 hours later, Isabella and Camille found themselves back at their isolated home, this time accompanied by a full FBI evidence team. The scene was dramatically different from their desperate flight the day before. The entire property was now secured with crime scene tape, and federal agents were methodically documenting and cataloging every aspect of the excavation site.
Isabella retrieved Augustella's journal from its hiding place in the fireplace chimney, handling it carefully as she turned it over to Agent Martinez. As he examined the water-damaged pages, she could see his excitement growing. "Mrs. Moreau, this is extraordinary," he said. "If this document is authentic, and preliminary examination suggests it is, it provides the most detailed contemporary account of Prohibition-era criminal activity we've ever seen in this region." Dr. Landry, who was now working with the FBI team, examined the journal with obvious fascination. "This could rewrite the history of organized crime in Louisiana during the 1920s, she said. Augustel Boudreau wasn't just a local smuggler. He was apparently connected to criminal organizations throughout the Gulf Coast region." "What does this mean for our legal situation?" Isabella asked. Agent Martinez exchanged glances with the federal prosecutor who had joined the investigation. "It potentially strengthens your position significantly," he said. "This journal, combined with the fact that you're the legal owners of the property where it was found, gives you a strong claim to any discoveries made here. But there will still be competing claims from other parties. The Thibodeau family will argue that their ancestors were partners in the original enterprise and therefore have rights to a share of the proceeds. The federal government will claim a portion under various antiquities and taxation laws. And there may be other descendants of the original criminal organization who come forward with their own claims." "How long will it take to sort all this out?" Camille asked. "Cases like this can take years to resolve," the prosecutor admitted.
But the good news is that the treasure isn't going anywhere. It will be held in federal custody while the legal issues are worked out, and everyone with a legitimate claim will have their day in court. As the afternoon wore on and the FBI team continued their work, Isabella began to understand the full magnitude of what they'd discovered. The excavation had now uncovered 4 separate caches with a total estimated value of over $25 million in current money. But more importantly, Augustel's journal had provided a roadmap to additional burial sites throughout the property. According to this journal, Dr. Landry explained, showing Isabella a hand-drawn map from Augustel's notes, there are at least 3 more major caches buried in different locations around your property. If those estimates are accurate, the total treasure could be worth $50 million or more. Isabella felt dizzy. $50 million was an amount of money so large she couldn't really comprehend it. Even a small percentage of that sum would solve every financial problem she and Camille had ever faced. But as she watched FBI agents carefully excavating what might be the largest treasure discovery in Louisiana history, Isabella also realized that their simple dream of finding a quiet place to call home had been completely transformed. They were no longer just a desperate mother and daughter looking for shelter. They were now key figures in a federal investigation, potential multimillionaires, and the targets of people who had been pursuing this treasure for nearly a century. The adventure was far from over, and Isabella was beginning to understand that the hardest challenges still lay ahead. But for the first time since David's death, she felt like they had a real chance not just to survive, but to build a future that neither of them had ever dared to imagine. As the sun set over the bayou and the FBI floodlights illuminated the excavation site, Isabella stood on the porch of their elevated house and watched history being unearthed from the mud below. Tomorrow would bring new revelations, new complications, and new dangers. But tonight, she and Camille were no longer homeless refugees. They were the owners of what might be the most valuable property in Louisiana, and the guardians of secrets that had been buried for nearly a century. The mystery of Augustel Boudreau's treasure was far from solved, but Isabella was beginning to believe they might actually survive long enough to see how it all ended. 6 months after that first terrifying night in the bayou, Isabella Moreau stood in the marble-floored lobby of the Federal Building in New Orleans, wearing her first tailored business suit and carrying a leather briefcase that contained documents worth more money than she had ever imagined possible. Beside her, Camille fidgeted in her own new dress. The 14-year-old had grown 3 inches during their legal odyssey, as if the stress and excitement had literally stretched her towards adulthood. "Mrs. Moreau," Agent Martinez approached with a smile that had become familiar over the months of depositions, hearings, and negotiations. "The final settlement hearing is about to begin. Are you ready?" Isabella took a deep breath. As ready as anyone can be to become accidentally wealthy, I suppose. The federal investigation had uncovered connections between Auguste's smuggling operation and organized crime families from New Orleans to Chicago, ultimately leading to the reopening of dozens of cold cases and the identification of previously unknown criminal networks. Dr. Landry had been right. The discovery had literally rewritten the history books about Prohibition-era crime in the American South. But for Isabella and Camille, the most important outcome had been the federal court's ruling on ownership of the treasure. After months of competing claims from the Thibodeau family, various government agencies, and alleged descendants of other members of Auguste's criminal organization, the court had ruled that Isabella and Camille, as the legitimate property owners who had made the discovery, were entitled to 60% of the treasure's value. 60% of $47 million. Even after federal taxes, legal fees, and court costs, they would receive approximately $22 million. "The Thibodeau family is here," Agent Martinez said quietly as they entered the courtroom. "They've accepted the settlement, but they're not happy about it." Isabella nodded, spotting the familiar figure of the elder Thibodeau sitting with his team of expensive lawyers. The federal investigation had revealed that his family's claims to the treasure were largely fraudulent, While they were indeed descendants of one of Auguste's partners in 1928, a full year before the treasure was buried, Auguste's journal had provided irrefutable documentation of the transaction. The Thibodeau family would receive a token settlement of $500,000, enough to avoid further legal challenges, but a fraction of what they had hoped to claim. "All rise," the bailiff announced, the Honorable Judge Patricia Camille presiding. Judge Camille had overseen the entire complex legal process with patience and wisdom, navigating between competing federal and state jurisdictions while ensuring that justice was served for all parties involved. She was a New Orleans native who understood both the historical significance of the discovery and the human drama at its center. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Camille began, "we are here today to finalize the settlement agreements in the matter of the Boudreaux treasure discovery. This case has required us to balance competing interests, the rights of property owners, the claims of historical stakeholders, the requirements of federal archaeological law, and the public interest in preserving our cultural heritage." She looked directly at Isabella and Camille. "Mrs. Moreau, Miss Moreau, your courage in coming forward with evidence that could have been easily concealed has been instrumental in ensuring that this treasure serves not just private interests, but the public good. The court is pleased to approve the settlement agreement that will provide substantial compensation for your discovery while also establishing the Boudreaux Historical Foundation to preserve and study these artifacts for future generations." The foundation was Isabella's idea, suggested during one of the many settlement conferences. Rather than simply dividing the treasure among private claimants, she had proposed that a significant portion be used to establish a permanent research center and museum dedicated to studying Prohibition-era history in Louisiana. The foundation would receive $10 million, while the remaining treasure would be divided among the various claimants according to the court's ruling. The court finds that the settlement agreement serves the interests of justice and historical preservation. Mrs. Moreau, as the primary discoverer and property owner, you will receive $22 million. The Thibodeau family, as descendants of a documented partner in the original enterprise, will receive $500,000. The remaining funds will establish the Boudreaux Historical Foundation, with Mrs. Moreau serving as the founding chairwoman. Isabella felt tears welling in her eyes. $24 million would have been life-changing enough, but the opportunity to help preserve this piece of history for future generations felt even more meaningful. Furthermore, Judge Camille added, the court is pleased to note that Mrs. Moreau has agreed to donate her family's property to the National Park Service, where it will be preserved as a historical site and made accessible to researchers and the public. The decision to donate the property had been difficult, but ultimately felt right. The isolated bayou location would be maintained as a historical site, with the elevated house preserved as an example of early 20th century Louisiana architecture. Visitors would be able to learn about both the legitimate history of families, like the Boudreaux, who had lived and worked in the wetlands, and the darker history of Prohibition-era criminal activity that had operated in these same waters. After the formal proceedings concluded and the paperwork was signed, Isabella and Camille found themselves on the courthouse steps, surrounded by journalists and television cameras. The media attention had been relentless throughout the legal process, turning their story into a modern treasure hunt that had captured the public imagination.
"Mrs. Moreau," called out a reporter from CNN, "how does it feel to go from facing homelessness to becoming one of Louisiana's wealthiest residents?" Isabella considered the question carefully. 6 months ago, she had been a desperate single mother with $2,800 to her name and no options left. Today, she was financially secure for the rest of her life, with enough money to ensure that Camille would never face the kind of desperation they had experienced. "It feels surreal," she said honestly. "But more importantly, it feels like we've been given an opportunity to do something meaningful with what we found. This treasure wasn't just money. It was a piece of history that belongs to all of us." "What are your plans now?" asked another reporter. Isabella looked at Camille, who smiled encouragingly. They had talked extensively about what they wanted to do with their newfound wealth, and they had reached some decisions that felt right for their family and their future. "We're going to finish Camille's education," Isabella said. She wants to study archaeology, inspired by Dr. Landry's work on our discovery. And I'm going to dedicate myself to running the Boudreaux Historical Foundation. There's still so much we don't know about the history of this region during Prohibition, and I want to make sure future researchers have the resources they need to uncover the truth. Any regrets about not just taking the money and disappearing? Asked a journalist from the Times-Picayune. Isabella shook her head firmly. None at all. Money can solve a lot of problems, but it can't give you purpose. What we found in that bayou wasn't just a treasure, it was a calling. 3 years later, Isabella stood on the observation deck of the Boudreaux Historical Center, watching as a group of middle school students took a guided tour of the restored property. The museum and research center had been built on a nearby piece of land, connected to the original Boudreaux house by an elevated boardwalk that allowed visitors to experience the unique ecosystem of the Louisiana wetlands. The museum told the complete story of the treasure discovery, from Auguste's original criminal enterprise through Isabella and Camille's accidental find to the complex legal process that had followed. But it also told the broader story of life in the Louisiana bayous, the legitimate businesses and families who had made their living from the wetlands, and the environmental challenges facing these unique ecosystems. "Mama," Camille called out, approaching across the deck. Now 17 and preparing for her freshman year at Tulane University, she had indeed chosen to study archaeology, with a specialty in Louisiana history. "The documentary crew is here for the final interviews." Isabella nodded, straightening her blazer. The Discovery Channel was producing a feature-length documentary about their story, which would air as part of their American Treasure Hunters series. The film crew had been following them for months, documenting both the historical research being conducted at the foundation and the personal journey that had brought them from desperation to prosperity. "Mrs. Moreau," the documentary director greeted them as they entered the conference room where the interview would be filmed. "We're ready for your final interview. This will be the capstone piece where you reflect on how this experience has changed your life." Isabella settled into the chair facing the cameras with Camille beside her. After 3 years of media attention, she had become comfortable with interviews, but this felt different, more personal, more reflective. "Let's start with a simple question," the director said. "If you could go back to that day when you first saw the classified ad for the Bayou property, knowing everything you know now, would you still buy it?" Isabella smiled, without hesitation, not because of the money, but because of everything that followed. "We found our purpose in that swamp, not just our fortune." "Can you elaborate on that?" "When David died, I felt like I'd lost not just my husband, but my identity. I was a widow, a struggling single mother, someone who things happened to rather than someone who made things happen. Buying that property, even though it seemed like a desperate mistake at the time, forced me to become someone who could take control of my own destiny." The interviewer nodded. "And Camille, how has this experience shaped your plans for the future?" Camille sat up straighter, displaying the confidence she had developed over the past 3 years. "It showed me that history isn't just something that happened to other people a long time ago. It's all around us, waiting to be discovered and understood. I want to spend my life uncovering stories like Auguste's, stories that help us understand who we are and where we came from."
Their story had ended not with a simple treasure hunt, but with the discovery that real wealth comes from finding your purpose and using your good fortune to serve something larger than yourself. And that was a treasure that no one could ever take away. 10 years after that first desperate night in the bayou, Isabella Moreau stood before the packed auditorium at the Louisiana State Museum, preparing to deliver what she knew would be the most important speech of her life. In the front row sat Camille, now 24, and Dr. Camille Moreau, having just completed her Ph.D. in maritime archaeology at Texas A&M University. Beside her was Deputy Robichaud, now Sheriff Robichaud, who had become like family to them over the years. The occasion was the 10th anniversary of the Boudreaux discovery, and Isabella had been asked to give the keynote address at a symposium on treasure, truth, and transformation, a decade of historical discovery in Louisiana. But she knew this speech would be about much more than archaeological findings or legal settlements. "Ladies and gentlemen," Isabella began, her voice carrying the confidence that had developed over a decade of public speaking. 10 years ago today, my daughter and I made what everyone told us was the worst decision of our lives. We spent our last $2,500 on a rotting shack in the middle of a Louisiana swamp." Gentle laughter rippled through the audience, which included archaeologists, historians, museum directors, and dozens of local residents whose lives had been touched by the Boudreaux discovery in ways both large and small. "What we found beneath that house changed our lives, of course, but more importantly, it changed our understanding of what it means to be guardians of history, of community, and of each other." Isabella clicked to her first slide, showing a photograph of their original property, the weathered house on stilts, surrounded by murky bayou water and draped with Spanish moss. The audience fell silent as they contemplated the humble origins of one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in American history. The Boudreaux treasure made headlines because of its monetary value. $47 million is certainly newsworthy. But today, I want to talk about the treasures we discovered that can't be measured in gold or currency. I want to talk about the real legacy of Auguste Boudreaux and what it has taught us about the power of second chances. Over the past decade, Isabella and the Foundation had continued to uncover new aspects of Auguste's story through careful research and archaeological investigation. What had emerged was far more complex than a simple tale of Prohibition-era crime. We learned that Auguste Boudreaux wasn't just a criminal who buried stolen money. He was also a man who recognized his mistakes and tried to make amends. The research had revealed that Auguste, in the years before his death, had been secretly returning portions of his criminal profits to the communities that had been harmed by his smuggling operations. He had funded schools, paid medical bills for families in need, and supported local businesses struggling during the Great Depression, all anonymously, all carefully documented in coded entries in his personal records. Auguste buried that treasure not just to hide it from his former partners or from federal agents, but because he was planning to use it for restitution. He died before he could complete his mission, but his detailed records showed exactly how he intended the money to be distributed. Isabella clicked to the next slide, showing a map of Louisiana with dozens of red dots marking communities where Auguste had planned to make anonymous donations. The Foundation had spent years tracking down these intended recipients and, where possible, fulfilling Auguste's original charitable intentions. This discovery changed how we approached the responsibility that comes with unexpected wealth. Camille and I didn't just inherit money, we inherited a mission that Auguste had left unfinished. The Foundation's work had expanded far beyond the original museum and research center. They had established scholarship programs in 37 Louisiana parishes, funded the restoration of historic buildings throughout Acadiana, and supported environmental conservation efforts across the Gulf Coast region. Every project was carefully chosen to align with what Auguste's records indicated he would have supported. But the most important treasure we found wasn't buried in the mud beneath our house. It was buried in ourselves. The discovery that ordinary people facing impossible circumstances can find the courage to do extraordinary things. She clicked to her first slide, showing photographs of the past decade. Camille receiving her doctorate,
Isabella speaking at international conferences on cultural heritage preservation, the dozens of students who had received Boudreaux Foundation scholarships and gone on to careers in archaeology, history, and environmental science. The night we first heard someone digging beneath our house, I thought we had stumbled into someone else's story. I was wrong. We had stumbled into our own story. We just didn't know it yet.
Isabella's voice grew more personal as she continued. Losing David nearly broke me. For 2 years, I felt like I was drowning, like every day was just about surviving until the next one. Buying that property felt like the last desperate act of someone who had run out of options. She paused, looking directly at Camille, who smiled encouragingly. What I learned in that bayou is that sometimes our darkest moments are actually doorways. Sometimes the thing that feels like failure is actually preparation for something we never could have imagined. The audience was completely silent now, drawn into the intimate reflection of a woman who had lived through an extraordinary transformation. The legal battles over the treasure took 3 years to resolve completely. During that time, Camille and I lived in a small apartment in New Orleans, and I worked part-time jobs while we waited to see if we would actually receive any of the settlement money. There were moments when I wondered if we had made a terrible mistake, if we should have just walked away from the whole situation. Isabella clicked to a slide showing newspaper headlines from the various legal proceedings. Treasure hunters challenge federal claims. Louisiana treasure battle continues. Bayou discovery sparks legal war. But even during the uncertainty, I noticed that something had changed in us. We had been tested in ways I never could have imagined, and we had not just survived, we had grown stronger. Camille had discovered her passion for archaeology. I had learned that I could be an advocate, a leader, someone who could fight for what was right even when the odds seemed impossible. The next slide showed the groundbreaking ceremony for the Boudreaux Historical Center, with Isabella and Camille holding shovels alongside state officials and community leaders. When we finally received the settlement, we had a choice. We could have taken the money and disappeared into comfortable obscurity. We could have bought a mansion, traveled the world, lived lives of leisure. Instead, we chose to honor August's unfinished mission and to use our discovery to serve something larger than ourselves. Isabella clicked through slides showing the various programs and initiatives the Foundation had supported over the years. Marine archaeology expeditions that had trained dozens of graduate students, coastal restoration projects that had helped protect vulnerable communities from hurricane damage, and educational programs that had reached thousands of Louisiana schoolchildren. The Boudreaux treasure has now directly supported the education of over 200 young people from low-income families throughout Louisiana. 63 of those students have graduated from college, including 12 who have gone on to advanced degrees in archaeology, history, or environmental science. 8 are now working as professional archaeologists, historians, or museum curators. She paused to let those numbers sink in. That's Auguste's real legacy, not the gold coins we dug up, but the human potential we've helped unleash. The next series of slides showed some of the Foundation's most successful scholarship recipients. Maria Gonzalez, who had discovered a previously unknown 18th century Spanish shipwreck off the Louisiana coast, James Washington, who had become the first African-American curator at the Louisiana State Museum, and Sarah Thibodeau, yes, a descendant of the same Thibodeau family that had tried to claim Auguste's treasure, who was now working on her master's thesis about the role of women in Prohibition-era Louisiana. One of the most remarkable aspects of this journey has been watching how the treasure discovery has brought together people and communities that had been divided for generations. The Thibodeau family, once our adversaries in court, are now partners in our research. Several members of their family have contributed oral histories and family documents that have enriched our understanding of the Prohibition era in Louisiana. Isabella clicked to a slide showing several members of the Thibodeau family in attendance. We've learned that healing historical wounds requires more than just money. It requires genuine reconciliation, shared purpose, and the humility to recognize that everyone's story matters.
The foundation had also worked to address some of the broader historical injustices that had been revealed through their research into August's activities. They had funded research into families that had been harmed by Prohibition-era criminal activity and, where possible, had provided financial support to their descendants. They had also supported research into the legitimate businesses and communities that had been disrupted by the criminal activity that August and others had engaged in. But tonight, I want to focus on the most important treasure of all, the transformation that happens when we choose to see crisis as opportunity, when we decide that our struggles can become the foundation for someone else's success. Isabella clicked to a slide showing a recent photograph of their original property. The elevated house had been carefully restored and was now the centerpiece of a beautiful historical park. Visitors could take guided tours that told the complete story of the Boudreaux discovery, from August's criminal enterprise through Isabella and Camille's accidental find to the ongoing work of the foundation.
"Thank you," Isabella whispered to the darkness, not entirely sure whether she was addressing Auguste Boudreaux, the bayou itself, or the mysterious forces that had brought them to this place at exactly the moment when they needed it most. "Thank you for the treasure. All of it." As they drove back toward New Orleans, Isabella reflected on the complete journey, from David's death and their financial collapse, through their desperate purchase of the swamp property, to the terrifying discovery that they weren't alone in their isolated home, through the legal battles and media attention, to the establishment of the foundation and all the lives it had touched. The story that had begun with grief and desperation had become one of hope, purpose, and transformation. They had started as refugees from personal disaster and had become leaders in their community, guardians of history, and examples of what was possible when ordinary people refused to give up in the face of impossible circumstances. But most importantly, they had discovered that real treasure isn't something you find, it's something you choose to become every day through the decisions you make about how to use whatever gifts life has given you. The bayou had given them back their lives. In return, they had given the bayou and the world a story worth telling, a foundation worth supporting, and a legacy that would inspire others long after they were gone. Some treasures, Isabella knew now, were meant to be shared, and some discoveries change not just the people who make them, but everyone whose lives they touch along the way. As the lights of New Orleans appeared on the horizon ahead of them, Isabella felt a deep sense of peace. Their story was complete, but its impact would continue for generations to come. That was the real treasure Auguste Boudreaux had left behind, not just gold and currency, but the opportunity for others to discover their own capacity for courage, generosity, and transformation. And that was a legacy worth more than all the buried treasure in Louisiana. The adventure that had begun in desperation had become a foundation for hope. The gamble that it seemed like certain failure had become the cornerstone of a life devoted to service. The secret that had been buried for nearly a century had become a gift to the future. Isabella and Camille's story was ending, but the stories of all the people they had helped, all the students they had educated, all the communities they had supported, those stories were just beginning. That was the true magic of the Boudreaux treasure. It had multiplied itself, growing from one family's desperate discovery into a force that would continue creating treasures for others long into the future. And in the end, that was exactly what Auguste Boudreaux had hoped for when he wrote those final words in his journal, asking whoever found his buried wealth to use it to repair the damage he had done and to help others find their way to better choices. Mission accomplished. Isabella and Camille's incredible journey from desperation to discovery to transformation shows us that our darkest moments can become doorways to purposes we never imagined. Their story reminds us that real treasure isn't what we find, but what we choose to become and how we choose to serve others with whatever gifts life gives us. Sometimes the best adventures begin when we're brave enough to take a leap of faith, even when we can't see where we'll land. Thank you for following their remarkable journey through all 5 parts of this incredible true story.